All right, it is 1:30, so we will get started. Welcome to those of you who are joining. My name is Elise Spronk, and I'm an occupational therapist at Kinetic Edge Physical Therapy, and I'm eager to be with you today. I wish that I could see your faces. Unfortunately, with these Zoom meetings, it's difficult. Yeah, we can't see each other. So anyway, just a few housekeeping things. I welcome questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can type that in the chat area, and I should be able to see that. Otherwise, feel free to unmute yourself and ask it that way. Either way, we will have a time at the end also to ask questions, but if you're like me, sometimes I forget about what I was going to ask by the time the end comes. So anyway, all right, so this is Sensory Processing 101. I plan on talking probably for 35 minutes or so. We'll get through our slides and then we'll have time for questions and answers. So anyway, we will get right on into the presentation here. So, all right, so this slide just kind of explains a little bit about why sensory processing is so important to all of development. Okay, so if our development is like a pyramid, and I say our because for adults this is the same thing. So we have academic learning up at the top, behavior and daily living activities right below that. And so those three areas are kind of the top areas where we hope that our children have success and are able to do things with, have things be as easy as possible for them. Okay, so below that are all sorts of developmental skills, perceptual motor and sensory motor skills that should be fairly automatic for the child. So using the two sides of the body together, visual, motor control, eye-hand coordination, gross motor coordination, awareness of your body, motor planning. You can see all of those things that should just kind of click and happen. But sometimes that isn't the case. And so at the very bottom of this pyramid is the sensory systems. And you can see then that they are the foundation upon which everything else is built. And so that's why when we have a child who is struggling maybe with behavior, why we always want to look at the bottom first. And so when we work with kids at Kinetic Edge, we do a bottom-up approach to determining where do we need to work and what skills do we need to work on. And sensory processing and reflex integration are the two areas that we look at first. This model has reflex maturity in the middle of it. There are other models that would put reflex maturity, reflex integration at the foundation along with the sensory processing. All right, so our sensory systems, those top five are common senses that our kids probably are even learning about in school. They're pretty well known, and oftentimes when we think about sensory processing issues, we maybe think about a child who is over responsive to sound, or maybe they don't like how things feel on their skin, such as clothing, that type of thing. Might be a picky eater. So those are a bit more common. The bottom three are a little lesser known, but equally as important as the top five. So vestibular is our brain's ability to detect movement. Okay, so it detects whether we are moving in a straight line, whether we're moving up and down, whether we're moving in diagonals, maybe we are upside down. Okay, so it's an important sense, and many of the other sensory systems build off of the vestibular system. There have been research studies that have shown that our language centers are actually firing more when we are moving. which is kind of reassuring for those kids who never stop moving, and probably why they are still able to listen and can, regurgitate information back to you, even though you feel like how could they possibly have been listening, because they were moving so much. Movement provides significant amount of information for our visual system, and it also supports other skills such as fine motor coordination, gross motor coordination. A lot of things depend on our vestibular or movement system. The next one there is proprioception. So this is our ability to know where we are in relationship to other objects and where our body parts are in relationship to each other. So it's our ability to know when we're walking, and maybe we see a curb coming up, we know how high we have to step in order to not stumble and trip on that curb. It's because of proprioception. This is also our ability to grade movement. So knowing how hard we should throw a ball at a friend who we're playing catch with, that has to do with, knowing how tight to hug somebody, or if we're wrestling, how much is too much. And so again, an extremely important sensory system, especially when it comes to behavior, because social skills rely on good proprioception. Nobody really loves to play with somebody who doesn't have good ability to know how hard to throw a ball at them. Okay, interoception is our internal sense. So our ability to know, are we hungry or full? Are we hot or cold? Some of us have a gradual thermostat, and some of us are, instantly hungry, instantly have to go to the bathroom, and just experience some of those internal senses a bit more intensely. All right, so what is sensory processing? It is something that occurs constantly throughout our day. So all day long, our bodies are taking in information from the world around us, and our brain is making sense of it so that we can act upon it. So it's an extremely, extremely important sensory experience, and crucial for our function. So sometimes we look at, is there a problem with sensory processing? And an issue with sensory processing can occur in one of three ways, or perhaps, there's an issue at each level here. So the first way is that the brain doesn't receive or detect the message. So you're, sitting in a classroom, and the teacher is giving out a verbal instruction, but your brain doesn't get that instruction because perhaps you're somebody who needs to be a bit more sensory than just a verbal instruction. So the brain doesn't receive that information. The second way is that the brain may be inefficient in what it does with the information once it receives it. So you receive the message, but now the brain is taking a bit longer to process that information, or perhaps it isn't organizing it in a way that's efficient to be able to use it. The third way would be that the brain now is sending out an inaccurate message to direct your actions. So I mentioned the example of stepping up on the curb. So maybe you saw that the curb was there, you got the correct information about how high that curb was, but now your brain sent out an inaccurate message to your foot, and you didn't step up high enough, and now you stumbled and fell on the curb. So anyway, you can see that any one of these three issues can cause a significant amount of difficulty for the child or adult. So when we work with kids in the clinic, we will have parents complete a sensory profile. So a sensory profile just gives us more information and helps us determine what is actually going on with the child's sensory processing. And I think it's important to point out that all of us are somewhere on this continuum of either needing a lot of sensory input in order to respond, or we maybe don't need quite as much sensory input and we notice things and we detect things and maybe become bothered by them. And so when we look through these 4 different sensory categories, we're going to see that there are 2 categories where there's a high need, a high threshold for sensory input, and there's 2 that are a low need or a low threshold. And oftentimes when we score and analyze the sensory profile, kids can score in more than one area. So they may be a sensory seeker with movement, but they might be a sensation avoider with sound or with touch, and it's not unusual for that to happen. Somebody's wondering about a recording. Yes, you will get an email link for a recording. So, all right, so let's look at each one of these categories. So sensation avoiding. Sensation avoiders are oftentimes the kids who maybe have some of the more significant behavioral issues. So sensation avoiders have a low threshold for sensory input, meaning it does not take much for them to notice and detect everything going on around them. And they can very quickly become bothered when that sensory experience becomes too much and that threshold gets met. So oftentimes we'll see these kids either withdraw or maybe have an outburst, a meltdown to get out of the situation because it's uncomfortable. And so these kids are often resistant to changes in routine. They like things to be very consistent, very much the same. And when things get outside of that, that's when you'll see either that withdrawing or the meltdown. And so our goal with the sensation avoiders is that we want to limit unfamiliar input while we broaden what's acceptable for them. So if they have a bubble of acceptable sensory experiences, we want to expand that so that things aren't maybe quite as new and novel all the time, so that they can truly enjoy different experiences and different activities. So sensation avoiders, oftentimes when we talk about like fight, flight, fright, they would maybe be considered to be in this, in that sense of alertness. So sensitivity to stimuli are also that low threshold. So again, very good detectors of information. They notice things very quickly. However, the sensitivity to stimuli or the sensors are going to be passive in their response to that. So they aren't having an outburst or a meltdown, but these people, kids, are very distractible. So they draw their attention to the newest thing that comes along. So they may be working perfectly fine on their individual work in their classroom, and then a student gets up to go ask the teacher a question, and now that child's distracted because they noticed that somebody else got up and moved around them. So again, with the sensitivity to stimuli, along with the sensation avoiders, they don't need more sensory input. They need the right kind of sensory input in order to be able to function. And so eventually here, we're going to look at what would be the right type of sensory input. So poor registration, sometimes these are called the bystanders. They have a high need for sensory input, but like the sensors or the sensitivity to stimuli, they are going to be passive in achieving that threshold. So oftentimes the poor registration kids don't have a whole lot of behavioral problems because they aren't bothering anybody. It's just that if something isn't sensory enough, they probably aren't going to notice it and probably aren't going to do anything about it. So oftentimes they might appear to be tired or lazy, maybe bored. Oftentimes it's been my experience that with these kids that they don't necessarily get detected as having an issue until maybe the middle elementary years, because now people aren't compensating for them when they give an instruction. So for example, in a classroom setting, if these kids receive an instruction to open up their math book to page 22, they aren't necessarily going to hear that, because maybe they needed it to be visual, maybe they needed a hand on their shoulder. And so up until around 3rd or 4th grade, the teacher maybe is like, oh, he didn't get that. And so you go, teacher gets the math book and opens it up to the correct page. Whereas when they start to get older, then, we're expecting more independence. And now we start to realize that these kids have probably missed out on some things. Oftentimes these kids, maybe as infants, were really, really good babies, tolerated a lot, and didn't really seem to, be bothered by much. The sensation seekers, like the poor registration, have a high threshold for sensory input. They need a lot, but they're going to be active in making sure that that threshold gets met. So these kids are the movers and the shakers. They are also, like the avoiders, probably getting in a little bit more trouble and having some issues with their behavior. But I'd like to point out, so they're fidgety and excitable, and they're, when they're supposed to be standing in a line, they're probably touching kids a lot, that type of thing. But what we want to point out is that you really need to determine if they are truly a sensory seeker, because they might respond and act a little bit like the avoiders, but we have to determine why they're acting that way. So the avoiders are acting that way to get out of a situation. They're fleeing, they're fighting, whereas the seekers are trying to just get more input. Okay, so with the seekers, they do need more sensory input. And so we want to give them appropriate sensory input at regular times throughout their day, so that they aren't having to seek it out themselves in an inappropriate way. So you can see where, you definitely want to make sure that you're dealing with the right category, because if you give an avoider lots more sensory input, it's not going to be helpful for them. It's going to be detrimental. So we need to determine, what exactly is going on, because sometimes the signals can get a little intercepted. So modulation. So like I said earlier, sometimes kids will score in maybe a high threshold. They might be a seeker in one area and avoider in another. And so you've got a combination there of high and low thresholds. And so what that might be predicting is an issue with modulation. So modulation is our brain's ability to get used to something. So either ramping it up so that we pay attention to it, or dampening it so that, and filtering it out so that we can pay attention to what we really need to. And sometimes with these kids, they just need a little more time to get used to a new task or a new environment. And as our society speeds up and we're switching activities and tasks really quickly, if there's a modulation issue, sometimes these kids just don't ever get an opportunity. So for example, you're doing a shaving cream activity and one of your kids is up to their eyeballs in shaving cream, probably a seeker, and your avoider is under the table and not wanting to participate. It's pretty easy to quickly determine, oh, they hated that, so I'm not going to do that again. But I'd encourage you to maybe do it again, but by themselves, so that you're not having to be worried about your seeker, jumping onto the couch covered in shaving cream. But you're able to provide tools and ways for the child to engage in the shaving cream without maybe touching it initially. Realizing, a paintbrush and some utensils can be a fun way to at least start the process, because again, their brain just might need a little extra time. So when we talk about sensory processing, we often talk about self-regulation. So self-regulation is really our ability to change our arousal state based on what situation we're in. So either changing how alert we are if we need to be paying better attention, or calming ourselves down. And oftentimes we will do this through sensory processing. You know, if you are super stressed at the end of your day and you say to your, you know, spouse or a friend, oh, I just had the worst day. And if that person said to you, oh, it'll be fine, just relax. It's not a very effective way of helping us relax, right? Not too many of us would say, oh yeah, you're right, I think I will just relax. But we would do something sensory in order to get our brain the endorphins it needs to calm it down. And so we would, you know, take a shower, sip on something to drink, listen to music, go for a walk. All of those are sensory experiences that are releasing endorphins to our brain to help us calm. And so self-regulation is an extremely important skill that sometimes comes automatically, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes a child or an adult needs some help in figuring out what it is that they can do in order to either be alert or be calm based on the situation. So one of the programs that we do with kids who are maybe having some difficulty with their sensory processing is called the ALERT program. And this is a program where a child learns about their own awareness of themselves. We use engine terminology to teach them about their brain and how it might feel if your engine was running really high or low or just right. And so it's a sensory and a cognitive approach to teaching about regulation. Most often kids are, you know, in the 8 to 12 age range, but we've definitely used it for younger kids and perhaps just teach parents a little bit more about the regulation tools, but the kids can still use some of that engine terminology. So it's just a good way to promote some of that regulation. I'm gonna kind of skip through that. So this is one of the tools that I found to be the most helpful in working with parents. It is called the Sensory Motor Planning Worksheet, and it is from Patricia Otter, who's an occupational therapist, developed this for the How Does Your Engine Run or the ALERT program. And so when we are looking at this chart, it is all based on studying the brain and how different sensory experiences impact our level of arousal. So when we are looking at the left-hand side of this chart, taste and smell and oral texture, those are the easiest sensory experiences for our brains to process. And so if you think about how a baby first learns to calm themselves, we give them something to suck on. So you can see up there on the top left-hand side of the chart that sucking on something sweet is the easiest sensory experience. Therefore, if something is easy, it's going to be calming. And so that is going to be a calming sensory experience. As we go down the columns, the experiences go from easy to process to more difficult to process for our brains, therefore goes from calming to more alerting. And so bitter smoke is going to be a much more alerting sense than sweet vanilla, okay? The middle two middle two rows are what we would consider neurologically organizing. And so when you think about that, think about yourself trying to stay awake late at night. Maybe you're trying to get home from something late and you're driving, or maybe you decided it'd be fun to watch a movie, but you're exhausted. And so you think about what kind of snack you would choose in order to organize your brain and be able to stay awake. And you probably would choose something salty and crunchy, or you maybe would chew on some sort of minty gum or a sour candy, something like that. And those are going to be something that's just going to be able to keep you right where you need to be, okay? As we move from left to right, we're looking at the sensory experiences becoming more difficult or more alerting. So on the very right-hand side of the columns, you'll see visual and auditory. Visual and auditory are the most difficult sensory experiences for our brain therefore they're very alerting. So when you think about your school-aged kids, and when they come home from school and they're just mentally exhausted and maybe they just lose it once they get home, think about where they've been spending a lot of their day. They've been spending it in language, which is at the very bottom right side of the chart. So language is very difficult for us to process. Also then think about your 2-year-old who's having a tantrum, and how many of you were successfully able to talk your 2-year-old out of the tantrum, right? Not very likely to happen because they're in the middle of a meltdown and language is the last thing they need in order to calm them down. So do all you can, but zip your lip and don't try and talk to them in that moment, okay? So when we go to the middle 3 columns, those are also going to be organizing just like the middle 2 rows. So tactile, vestibular movement, vestibular gravity, all going to be a nice organizing sensory experience. So sometimes you'll maybe hear the term heavy work. Heavy work is something that engages our joints and muscles, which our joints have receptors, again, which when we stimulate them, it releases good endorphins to our brain to promote calming. It's why you can go for a run or do yoga, stretching, and you just feel energized, right? Because of the endorphin release. So when trying to calm your child down, you're wanting to give deep pressure, heavy touch. Think about what you did with your babies, right? You kind of go back to that. You offer something for the mouth to suck on. You maybe give a deep pressure, heavy touch like you would have swaddled, and bouncing, oscillation right there in the center of the chart, or swinging, rocking, all going to be very organizing for the brain. And then instead of talking, maybe you just do a little shh, right? Or, you know, if you've got the appropriately aged child, you can do some sing-songy speech, rhyming. Kindergarten teachers, preschool teachers are amazing at this and can get, you know, a group of 20 kids to just follow in a line and, you know, pay attention to verbal instructions because they're using sing-songy speech, and it's just easier for the brain to process. At the very bottom of this page, you're going to see that there's ways that we can switch up some variables. So let's say you have a child who loves to jump on a trampoline, and if they could jump all day, they'd be the happiest, right? Or swing all day, but that's not feasible. That's not functional. So we can't change the duration of that input. We can't let them do that all day, but we can change some of those other variables. We can change the frequency. So how often are we suggesting or allowing some of that trampoline time or swinging time? Maybe we change the intensity of it. So you've got 5 minutes before school, but I want you to go out and jump as high as you can and as hard as you can for 5 minutes. So now we've increased the intensity of that. Or maybe we change up the rhythm. So now you're going to jump big, big, little, big, big, little. And so you've changed the rhythm. And by doing that, maybe you can get by with not having to jump quite as long. And every sensory experience can be, the variables can be worked out, right? So maybe you've got a child who could chew gum all day. And if they could chew gum all day, life would be better, but that's not good for us, right? No dentist in the world would say, yeah, let your kid chew gum all day. So we need to change up the variables. So maybe we change, you know, instead of chewing gum all day, they can have a stick of gum on the way to school. They can have a stick of gum during math class because that's the hardest class for them. And then when they get home, you have another chewy snack for them. Or maybe you've tried gum and it wasn't really that helpful. Well, maybe you gave them just a stick of, you know, a thin piece of gum. Maybe though they need the thick Bubblicious, or maybe they need 3 pieces of gum. So they need a little more intensity of the gum. So you can see, again, we can change those variables and hopefully get some help for our kids who need that. Okay, So now these next slides are just some more examples based off of that chart of some organizing sensory activities, and then we're going to kind of go through each sense. So things that can be organizing. And again, if in doubt, if you're not sure, do I have a seeker or do I have an avoider? If in doubt, I always recommend go to the organizing, do heavy work, provide deep pressure. And so, limit some of that auditory input. So maybe there's just too much going on as far as sounds are concerned. Reduce the loud surprise factor. Provide, I'd mentioned linear and oscillating, so jumping and swinging. Provide some of that type of movement. Give deep, firm pressure touch. It's always going to be better than tickling. In fact, tickling travels the same pathway to our brain as pain. And so sometimes your kids will say, oh, tickle me, but do they really want to be tickled or do they want deep pressure, firm touch? And so I would challenge to really decide whether or not they like tickling. I mean, I can remember getting tickled as a kid, and I was usually trying to get the heck out of Dodge and escape because it wasn't fun, and most of the time that's the case. So I'd recommend that deep pressure, firm touch. Each morning, outline the schedule for the day, especially for those kids, the avoiders, the sensitivity sensors who need things to be routine and need it to be the same. So give them a schedule, let them know what's happening next, and discuss unexpected events before they occur so they have the heads up. Because as much as we'd like to provide routine, that's not practical. There's going to be times where something changes. And so if we can do some things to limit the trauma of the change, it should be received a little bit more positively. Use cleanup songs, make up songs for any type of transition. Again, sing-songy speech, rhythm, rhyming is going to be much more well received than just verbal language. Limit extra visual material. So, sometimes we've got kids who get into a playroom and just don't even know what to do, and they just start dumping toys everywhere. Well, maybe it's too visually stimulating for them. So remove half of the toys, recycle the toys, put half of them away and bring them out again later, or get cubbies that aren't necessarily clear plastic cubbies, but where, you can't necessarily see everything out all at once. And then provide some organization and label things just to decrease some of that visual input. Provide a quiet corner or a hideout area. I can't emphasize this enough. Sometimes, especially after school when they've been so perhaps overstimulated throughout the day, giving some space and giving an area that's just theirs to maybe do some of those favorite tactile activities or some sensory calming activities, but in a quiet space. Breathing before transitions, again, going to get a lot of good endorphin release. You're using your mouth. It's just a great activity. Marching and wall push-ups, chair push-ups, all of those are engaging joints and muscles, again, for endorphin release to help calm. And then hand fidgets can be helpful. Sometimes kids are just a kiddo who needs to hold something. There's some reflex implications in that as well. But this is a sensory talk, so I'm not going to talk too much about that, but they sometimes just need that pressure in their palm. And this spot right here, it's our Babkin spot. I'm sorry, I'm getting into the reflexes. It releases endorphins to our brain. And so hand fidgets can actually, provide that input to, again, help with the regulation. And then movement breaks are always good. All of us have a hard time sitting for a long time. And so allowing kids to move is going to be beneficial. Some additional auditory activities. some of these were mentioned before. Maybe trying to limit through noise canceling headphones, that can be helpful. I think the thing I really want to emphasize though is that through my 16 years of focusing on sensory processing and working with kids, I've really come to realize that we don't have to just provide ways to compensate for sensory systems. Our brain is forever changeable. And there's different techniques and exercises and movements that can stimulate the areas of the brain that are dysfunctional when we are over responding or under responding to sensory input. So I want to make sure you know that, so that you don't have to just, a child doesn't just have to live with this stuff and eventually hope that they outgrow it. I think there's room for the brain to adapt and change the brain and how it's receiving that sensory input. So keep that in the back of your mind as we continue to go through these strategies. These can be strategies that can be helpful while we're working on the changing the brain and how it responds. So oral activities, again, oral is the very first way we learn to calm ourselves, so it can continue to be an important sense for us throughout our life. A lot of adults continue to use oral input for sensory regulation. So, just thinking about different ways to get that. I love the Camelback water bottles because the mouthpiece is a little bigger and you kind of have to chew and suck on it. So tactile activities, again, I talked a little bit about this. Deep pressure is always, in my opinion, going to be much more calming and regulating, organizing. And so if in doubt, go to that. There can be real concerns with clothing and how we tolerate different sensory input through our skin. Our skin is a powerful sensory organ. And so fortunately, it's a great tool as well to get those endorphins to our brain. So using that tool can be very helpful, even in helping with other sensory dysfunctions. So proprioception, this is kind of that heavy work, deep pressure. If you have a child who's jumping all over your furniture and driving you crazy, provide, go get a cheap mattress, throw it on the floor and let them, have a place that's acceptable to jump and crash onto. Some kids, we'll see those kids, they need to fall just for the sake of falling because they like how it feels. And so let's give them some positive ways to do that at different times throughout the day, so that they aren't having to do that necessarily when they're standing in line with their classmates. Stretchy bands, so exercise tubing can be helpful. Fabric tunnels, so using Lycra, making a tunnel, letting kids crawl through it, all fun sensory activities. Sorry, I'm kind of flying through this, but I want to be respectful of time and give us an opportunity for questions. So balance and movement activities, can't emphasize this enough. Movement is so very, very important. It's just a way to soak our brains in good endorphins. And so get your kids moving, jumping, rolling, swinging. Spinning is going to be very alerting, so sensory seekers will love it and thrive with it, but the sensory avoiders aren't going to like it, so that's okay. But spinning for sensory seekers, there was one study that showed that good spinning can give enough sensory input to last 8 hours. So if your school playgrounds have merry-go-rounds, beg them to keep them and not get rid of them, because it's one of the best ways to get that spinning input. Obstacle courses are fun and can be made with anything in your home: couch cushions, pillows, 2x4s. You don't need fancy things to make obstacle courses. Hanging upside down can be calming for some kids. again, that'll be more of a seeker activity. But, you know, realize that if your kid is sitting on the couch hanging upside down, that's probably okay. They're getting some movement vestibular input. And so not the end of the world. T-stools are just a stool that has one leg and then a seat kind of like this. It gives the child a sense of movement without necessarily having to move a whole lot. Same thing with move and sit cushions. You know, it's just a fancy little cushion you can put in a chair. Again, gives the child kind of that sense of movement, but they aren't having to move all over the place. A beach ball with just a little bit of air is a $1 way to try a move and sit cushion to determine if it would be helpful for your child. Placing TheraBand on the legs of a chair so that they have something to push against with their feet, especially for those kids who are constantly moving their legs. Again, just another way to get that movement, as well as with the TheraBand, they get the deep pressure and the joint muscle activity. So a little more bang for your buck there. Visual and sight activities. So just thinking about even the lighting in the child's environment. Fluorescent lighting can be overstimulating for a lot of kids. So, you know, looking at natural light options. You know, a lot of times because visual and auditory are the more alerting, we're looking at removing some of that more than we are adding it. Although sometimes there's, you know, neat little bubblers and the word is slipping my mind right now, but the little things that you can kind of turn, and the oil and water and sand, you know, kind of slowly go down, and you know, some of those things can be very calming. But otherwise, we're looking at, you know, can we remove some visual information like from worksheets, or you know, using bookmarks in books because there's too many words that are, you know, presented all at once. And so, you know, determining, does my child need more visual or less visual input? So if you feel like you've got a little bit more of a complex situation and you're struggling, I would recommend seeking out an occupational therapist to help you with this. It can save you a lot of headache and heartache, and you know, just kind of help you navigate what you're dealing with, because you do want to make sure that you're looking at all of the possibilities of what's you know, causing some of the dysfunction for your child. And we always look at dysfunction. You know, again, all of us are somewhere on that continuum and have different sensory preferences. It's only when those preferences start limiting your participation or your ability to learn or your ability to, you know, complete your daily activities that we become concerned about it. And so, you know, it's never because, well, my son is a sensory seeker, but I'd really, you know, feel like it'd be a lot more fun if he, you know, just was one of those easygoing, poor registration kids. We're not ever trying to shift a child into a different category. We're just trying to give them the tools that they need to make it so that it isn't interfering in their daily activity. Hopefully that makes sense. So. And then ultimately, we just need to live under one roof, right? This is a really old family picture of my family. The biggest kid there is turning 18 in 2 days, so really old family picture. But, you know, it is a process. It's figuring out, you know, you're not all the same. And so how can we all, you know, live under one roof and function harmoniously as possible and not drive each other nuts? So. All right, so let's get to some questions and comments. My email address is on this slide. If you'd rather email me instead of asking right now, that's 100% fine. So elises@kineticedgept.com. And then I'm also going to put up a QR code here. You can scan this. We have occupational therapy focusing on sensory processing in our Ames, Des Moines, Newton, Oskaloosa, and Pella clinics. And sometimes you just need to talk to somebody and you just need to find out, should I be concerned about this, or is this not a big deal? So if that's, what you're interested in, we are more than happy to do that on a complimentary basis. So anyway, all right, questions from all of you? I'm doing the classic count to 10. I think, oh yes, we've got one. How can you tell if a child is sensitive to noise versus actual sensory or actual processing problem? Mine is very sensitive to just that, but nothing else. Great question. And so again, I'm going to bring it back to function. And so if that sensitivity to noise is keeping them from being able to use a public restroom, it's keeping them from being able to enjoy, going to assemblies at school, or it's keeping them from being able to pay attention because, whenever a car drives by, they're having to think about the car driving by. I think that's, the thing you really want to look at. And, there's probably some things that can be done to help that child. And really, I think we just, as parents, we really just want our kids to be joy-filled and, do the best they can. And so if the sensitivity problems, and it's kind of hard yet to determine, is it just a sensitivity to noise, or is it an actual processing problem? Well, it could be both, right? And so that's when you want to really look at the level of disruption to their day. And, yeah, you could, can you compensate for it? Can you, do different things to limit that auditory input? Or, are there some other things that could be done in order to make them, their brain more tolerant so that they don't remain at that same level of sensitivity? So, and, again, there's always the free screen option. So, but I would always bring it back to function. So, let's see. Yeah, do you offer parent education opportunities and appointments? I know we can do sessions with our kids. Yes, but do you educate the parents in the session too? We certainly try. Hi, Laura. I know that can be a challenge when the child is along. And sometimes, we can get the child doing an activity, and then we can do some of that parent education, but parent education is super duper important. So if that's a main priority of yours, we can certainly arrange for that. So let's see. My son has started to become more defiant. Can this be a part of his sensory processing? Absolutely. And I think, you always have to look at the why behind the what, so the what is the defiance and why is it happening? And so, I would look at defiance and yes, let's first check what their sensory processing is. Are they being defiant to certain experiences and environmental things? And I think sometimes you can see a pattern in that and sometimes you can't. And one of the best quotes I ever read about sensory processing is that the consistency is in the inconsistency. And just when you think you've figured it out, then something might change. And that certainly can be a sensory processing issue. The second thing that I would really encourage you to look at or have looked at for your defiant child is their reflexes. So primitive reflexes, if a child has quite a few retained reflexes, they essentially are also in that fight, flight, fright stage. And so if you're just constantly in fight, flight, fright, you're going to be defiant. And so really it's a two two-pronged approach. We want to check the sensory processing, and then we also want to check the reflex integration. And I'm doing a reflex integration talk, I think, in a month, same time, 1:30. So if you're interested in that, you can join us again on that. But definitely, I think defiance. You have to determine why the child is, why their behavior is the way it is. So just a very important piece of the puzzle. So any other questions? Those were great ones. All right, I will stick on here for a couple more minutes in case somebody does have an additional question. But otherwise, you've all been a great audience. I wish I could see you. But yeah, oh, hold on, we got another question here. So if you want to stick on and listen to this, feel free. So are you doing free screening in Pella soon? Yes, we'll do a free screening whenever you'd like. So sometimes we do free screening events and you can wait for those, but otherwise you can give any one of our clinics a call and set up a free screening. The difference between a screening and an evaluation, for those of you who might be wondering about that, a screening is typically a 20-minute appointment, and it's a combination of looking at your child. Will assess a few different things, some of the things that we would assess in a full evaluation, and then we'll visit to determine, and it's really used to determine whether or not an occupational therapy evaluation would be helpful. And so, yeah, it's a little bit shorter, but it's a good way to make contact and to be able to decide whether or not, further evaluation would be helpful. And then a full evaluation is going to be a longer appointment. We're going to test more things. And it's just a bit more comprehensive. We will still visit with you as a parents. We gain a lot of information and knowledge from that conversation, and then can determine if treatment is necessary and if that would be helpful. So in our occupational therapy treatment sessions are around 40 minutes in length. We have a pretty extensive home exercise program, and I try to emphasize that doing the home exercise program is crucial to how quickly you'll see progress with your kids. So. All right. Okay. So I think, yeah, again, I'll stay on here for a couple more minutes, and then feel free also again to email me if you'd prefer to ask your questions that way. Elise S@kineticedgept.com. So thanks for joining. All right, I'm going to sign off here. So it looks like most everybody has left the meeting. So thanks so much.